Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring the absolutely fascinating modern resurgence of the mid-20th century philosopher Hannah Arendt. She belonged to this generation of thinkers who were just suddenly thrust into a world of total political and economic chaos, fascism, and war. They were, sadly, well practiced in being appalled by historical events. Yet here we are, decades after her death in 1975, and her incredibly complex, fiercely creative ideas about power, terror, and freedom, they are echoing super loudly across our own contemporary political landscape. Just to put that into perspective, consider this staggering starting point. There was a literal 1,000% increase in the sales of Arendt's landmark 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in the year right after the 2016 US election. A 1,000% jump? Suddenly, these tweet-sized quotes from her writing were just fluttering all over the internet, and Arendt-themed opinion pieces were everywhere. People were watching a politics of the absurd, the cruel, and the mendacious kind of return to the global stage, and it's like we all collectively realized, wait, Hannah Arendt seems to have something deeply important to say about this.
And that brings us to our source material today. Lyndsey Stonebridge's fantastic book, We Are Free to Change the World, unpacks exactly why Arendt's work so suddenly became a survival guide for a whole new generation. We hear a lot that we're living in a post-truth era, right? Well, Arendt actually lived through a post-truth era herself. She saw firsthand what happens when people no longer share the same basic sense of the world they inhabit together. Stonebridge's analysis is so crucial here because it helps us understand exactly what we stand to lose when we let our politics become completely detached from actual human reality.
So let's move into our first section, the return of Arendt, and take a look at the anatomy of these regimes.
To really grasp what Arendt was describing back in 1951 and why it hits so close to home today, we need to look at how she analyzed the regimes of her time. She specifically warned about conditions where hate and fear basically dominated everything. She looked at how historical conditions essentially conspired to give evil this shockingly modern political shape. We're talking about a place where political lies triumphed completely over facts, leaving nothing but raw power, violence, and rigid ideology. She was asking those massive, essential questions. What happened? Why did it happen? How could this have possibly happened? Because honestly, the old political and historical narratives of her time just couldn't explain the sheer, unimaginable scale of the atrocities she witnessed.
Which leads us to Section 2, Echoes of Totalitarianism, and how that cultural rot lingers.
Now, when we compare the past to the present, Arendt had this very clear warning. She noted that while specific regimes do eventually fall, the underlying cultural rot that allowed them to rise in the first place can linger for a long time. So sure, we might not see marching jackboots everywhere today, but commentators point out that our modern political culture absolutely shares some creeping elements of totalitarian thinking. Today's authoritarians deliberately cultivate this widespread cynicism and a real indifference to reason. We're seeing this sort of vague, inchoate hate that's just waiting to be directed at anyone, along with the flourishing of wild conspiracy theories, self-censorship, and honestly, profound loneliness. And tragically, we still see a tacit acceptance that certain groups of people, refugees, the uprooted, the poor, are treated as completely superfluous, just administered with a thoughtless cruelty like they're little more than freight.
Let's transition to Section 3, the refugee experience, to understand her life of displacement.
To truly get where Arendt is coming from, we absolutely have to look at her lived experience. Her political thought wasn't dreamed up in some comfortable ivory tower, It was forged while she was a stateless refugee, literally escaping fascist Europe. Take a moment to really process this devastating reflection she wrote in 1943 from her essay, We Refugees. It highlights this profound, total loss of normalcy that completely shaped her political theories. She wrote this from New York after fleeing the black heart of a crumbling Europe. And she points out that they didn't just lose their physical homes. They lost their occupations, their confidence that they were even of use in the world, the basic naturalness of reacting in their native language. They suffered the rupture of their private lives as friends and relatives were killed. It was, in her eyes, an absolute erasure of the human condition.
But here is the wild part. This massive tragedy actually gave her what she famously called the priceless advantage of the pariah. It gave her the ability to see political reality clearly from the outside, completely cutting through the lies and propaganda. She noted that no one is better at marking the borders of a terrain than the person who has to walk around it from the outside. Because she was stateless, because she was literally forced to view the entire political system from the absolute margins, she could see right through the manufactured outrage and the false justifications for cruel policies. The very things that completely blinded so many insiders, she saw with crystal clarity.
Let's move to our final section, thinking and freedom, and how we go about defending our minds.
Now, to organize all this chaotic history into something we can actually digest, Arendt had this famous habit of categorizing concepts into threes. It was her way of bringing clarity to dangerously obscure political systems. You might be wondering, how do we protect our freedom against these massive forces? Well, for Arendt, the answer always starts with the mind. We see her break down modern evils, human actions, the realms we inhabit, and the faculties of the mind into these distinct triads. But she didn't do this to build some rigid, boring philosophical system. Actually, she kind of mocked philosophers who played dialectical games trying to find meaning in extermination camps. Instead, she used these distinctions to prove she was all about the plurality of the many rather than the tyranny of the one. She wanted politics to be exactly what it should be: crowded, busy, lively, and beautifully unpredictable.
She also fiercely championed this concept of an enlarged mentality, which she drew from Immanuel Kant. She taught that a critical imagination and a free mind are hands down the absolute best defenses we have against satisfying, easy ideologies and dogmas. Now, a quick caveat here. This isn't necessarily about empathy. It's not just about feeling what someone else feels. It's actually about thinking your own thoughts, but spatially positioning your mind in the place of somebody else. It's like a rigorous critical workout for your brain. By constantly viewing reality from multiple angles, you essentially inoculate yourself against those one-size-fits-all, easy answers that authoritarians love to hand out.
And this really gets right to the core message of her legacy. Arendt didn't offer quick, easy fixes to defeat autocracy. She didn't hand us a neat little step-by-step manual for jump-starting social democracy. Rather, she taught that freedom is actually already latent right here among us. It's not some abstract concept you conjure out of thin air. It becomes real only when we actively refuse powerlessness, when we turn our backs on dogma, and when we make the conscious choice to act together. For Arendt, freedom literally begins with the determination to exist as a fully living, thinking person in a shared world.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with Hannah Arendt's most foundational and honestly, most provocative prompt to ask yourself about our own political reality right now. Amidst all the noise, the deep cynicism, and the constantly shifting truths of our modern era, her ultimate advice was stunningly simple. Think what we are doing. Are we just relying on ready-made political narratives that someone else handed us, or are we actually daring to look at the human experience with a free and critical mind? What fences and bridges do we need to build to protect freedom, and which walls do we need to tear down? The choice and the profound responsibility to think is entirely ours.